Okay. All right. Thanks for coming. We're going to talk about basically an introduction to evolutionary algorithms, and we'll try to talk about some applications of it. Unfortunately, they didn't put a clock back there, so if I run long or short, then we'll blame Noid. I'm Rooster. I used to give talks a long time ago. I don't know if anybody remembers me. I mostly focus on internet security, but on the side I dealt with viruses and bacteria-type simulations and worms, and now I'm in school for mathematical biology. So this is actually a very big interest to me and mine. And basically, coming away from this talk is not really so much trying to say, like, this is how you write an evolutionary algorithm or this is how you write a genetic algorithm. It's more to put an interest in your ear about how they work and what they can do. Most of the work in this area is completely theoretical, and it's sometimes even hard to find a problem that can be solved by some of these solutions. But in the end, it should get you thinking about possible uses or just move in that direction. So, a quick overview. Evolutionary computing is basically an optimization heuristic algorithm. And what heuristic algorithm basically means is that it's a way of solving a problem by learning and not expecting to reach the absolute best solution. Its goal is to get the closest as humanly or as computerly possible without actually necessarily having to reach the top. And we are doing this using biological concepts. Somebody at some point said that biology is nothing more than an algorithm looking through a certain set of space to determine a solution. In our case, the solution is survival. So can we use it? Can we emulate these kind of things to be able to solve our own problems? So first, we have to coach things in computer science terms, because all of this in the end comes down to computer science. And computer scientists, basically, when you're in school getting your CS degree, the biggest thing they teach you in these classes is how to make your problems map to something that you can solve. How to create these kind of solution spaces. So in one case, we have what's called a search space. And a search space is really a collection of all possible solutions. It also includes a concept of distance between all the possible solutions. So you can kind of picture it as a big map. As an example, the one I brought up here was a protein search. So if you're trying to find some kind of a protein, let's say you're trying to have one that'll develop an antibody or something like that for a particular virus. There are 20 different amino acids, if anybody knows, that create proteins. So you have to be able to combine all these amino acids in such a way to try to create this protein. Well, that's infinite, obviously. There's an infinite search space, and it would be impossible to go through. So even restricting it down, say to a chain of 100 amino acids or less, restrict that down. Even with such a search space, you're still looking at a huge amount of data to try to go through. And say, for instance, we represent each amino acid by a letter, A through, I guess it would be L or V or whatever. You need to have some kind of an algorithm to go through that. Now, traditional searches, if anybody's familiar with binary, or traditional searches, not sorts, searches, do all kinds of things where they either split solutions and look either side of it, or other kinds of ways of mapping through it. But there's no learning involved in any of that. It always does the same thing over and over again. What we want to do is find a way that when it makes an iteration, it figures out maybe a little bit more information about how to get that result. And one analogy that computer scientists use for this is called fitness landscapes. So in our example, a fitness landscape will represent a presentation of all the possible amino acid chains. I can figure it's like a big flat map, and each step in the map is an amino acid chain. And each amino acid chain is made up of a string. And we'll say that's a string length, it's a length of L. The distance between the string is their Hamming distance. And what all a Hamming distance is it's a term that implies what it takes for this string to become this string. So for instance, if you have a string that's AAAD and another string that's AAAA, the Hamming distance is 1 because it only takes one thing to change that string to the other. So you solve for that Hamming string. And each amino acid chain, you give it each amino acid, you give it a fitness as well. So that graph becomes just a flat graph, which ends up being with bumps because each amino acid has a little bit more fitness, or it might be a little bit farther from another one. So you end up with a terrain, if you will. And that's how a fitness landscape is made. So in our case, we're going to look at this as an actual terrain, and we're going to say that our algorithm is a hiker, traversing through this terrain, trying to find our solution. The first thing we can do, we can try to find our solution, is we can have our hiker walk through every single point of the entire terrain. Start on the east side, take each step all the way through into the west side, all over the place, and he will be guaranteed that they will find the absolute best solution. Guaranteed. Obviously, doing this, it's going to be slow. By the way, feel free to ask me questions or raise your hand or something if I say something confusing. He's guaranteed to reach the highest point to find the best solution. There's no way around it. In fact, it is the only certain way of finding the correct solution. Of course, this is overwhelmingly time-consuming and it's processor-intensive. If you imagine doing something, basically 800 bazillion times. Another possible method of going through these fitness landscapes is using something called hill climbing. Hill climbing assumes that our fitness landscape looks more like a mountain, so that the bottom edges are all very flat, where our solutions are less likely to be correct. As it moves up higher and higher up the mountain to the very top, we reach the most optimal solution. So what we do is we basically start at the bottom and we just move up. We don't move to the side. We go straight to the top until we reach the top, and that's our solution. This is okay, and it's very useful, but it can be particularly problematic if we're looking at a much more diverse type landscape. And we'll talk about hill climbing in a minute. There are other types of searches as well. We can make more explorers and put them all over the place. We can make them more intelligent about how they decide which direction they're going to go in. And we'll look at genetic algorithms that do that. And then we can give them the ability to climb downhill as well. And we'll see that simulated annealing does that. Now, the fitness landscape metaphor isn't perfect. It's slightly flawed, like anything else when you're trying to force every type of problem into one type of solution. In real-world solutions, large-scale problems are never solved this way. If you're going to be building a house, you don't decide where you're going to put the bricks and then decide that where you're going to put the plumbing and eventually where you decide where you're going to put your bed. You start out by drawing a picture of the house and then recursively coming farther and farther until you get to the point where you're ready to lay the bricks out. So trying to look at things as a fitness landscape or look at each individual bit, it gets a little hard for our mind to be able to deal with that. In our mind, a landscape has two dimensions, or three dimensions, right? X, Y, and Z axis. We can't really picture any more parameters than that. So if our fitness landscape starts to get outside the scope of what our mind can imagine, it's hard to conceptually use it. We assume that the points on the landscape are actually neighbors, that we can actually move freely from all over these points, that they're all available to us, which isn't necessarily true. And we're also assuming that all paths are symmetric. That if I'm at point A and I go to point B, that going from point B to point back to point A is also available, which is not necessarily true either. So we're making all these assumptions inside our fitness landscape, which basically means that if we're trying to solve a problem that fits outside the fitness landscape, then we find another way of solving it. So just trying to point out there are things that aren't always easily solved this way. Hill climbing algorithm, we were going to talk about this for a second. It's basically, its main feature is for maximizing or minimizing a function that has a discrete state, which means it has a finite amount of state. You can look at it as the problems that are represented as vertices on the graph. So you have the graph and it's all the little crisscrosses, and each solution is basically just that intersection point or vertex in this graph. The algorithm will follow the vertex looking for a path up. And as it follows, it finds that path up. As we mentioned, it keeps going up to the top. Now, there's a couple of different ways that it can do this. We have simple hill climbing, which basically finds the closest path up and just jets up it, and keeps going up and up and up like this. Now, the problem with this is, of course, as you can imagine, as you're starting to move up, you're more likely to hit what would be called your local maxima, which means that if I've got, say, 2 mountains, and I climb up to the top of this one, it's a solution, but it's not necessarily the best. The best would be at the top of this other mountain. One way around that is using what's called steepest ascent search, where it looks around the algorithm, looking at all the different possible gradients, and it chooses the one that's the steepest, and it takes that path up. Goes to the next one, looks around at which one's the steepest, and takes that path up, and so it climbs all the way up. Steepest ascension, but that isn't even perfect in itself, right? Because once again, it is still possible, even with that, to end up on the top of a small mountain. So the next solution was the shotgun hill climbing. And basically what that means is, as I'm taking the algorithm through its steps, and I take it to the top of a mountain, I then randomly move to another place, and I move up the hill climbing algorithm. And I do more comparisons. And I do this over and over again at many different spots. And then in the end, what should happen is I should, with all that randomization, be able to find my optimal solution. Anybody have any questions about that? All right, move on. The first one we're going to talk about is, or the first real one other than hill climbing, is simulated annealing. Now, this one isn't really a biological process, but it always gets thrown in, mostly because it's the way it manages through the search space and because it uses populations. Now, so annealing is basically the process of metal heating up and cooling down. And that's in the annealing property is what the cooling property. So when metal is heated up to its melting point, there's a tremendous amount of energy. If anybody's taken physics class, they've seen this. There's a tremendous amount of energy caught up in this metal. And how this looks is as the molecules are shaking all over the place. Now, as the metal starts to cool and the temperature comes down, the molecules have less space that they can move around in, and to the point of when they finally stop moving and they develop a crystal structure, and then it's done. Now, we'll see that this actually applies in our algorithm as well. If an algorithm cools too fast, if a metal cools too fast, then the crystal structure starts to become too brittle, and the metal is pretty faulty. If you control the way the cooling happens, it creates a much stronger metal. So how do we then translate this whole concept of this metal cooling into an algorithm, and how do we use it? Let's see. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a random solution. Now, one thing we'll see here with simulated annealing versus what we'll look at further in genetic algorithms, we're going to use one solution. So we're going to randomly come up with a solution, generate that, and that's going to be our current solution. We're going to assess the solution. Now, one thing you're going to find is all these algorithms and stuff are fairly simple. Some of the implementations inside them are more complex. For instance, assessing the solution. It's really easy to say, just look to see to make sure that it's the best. How you do that is it's very complicated, and depending on what your problem is. Simpler problems are obviously much easier to assess than more complex ones. So in this point in our algorithm, we determine how close the optimal solution is to the current solution. And of course, that's dependent on the problem being solved. The energy in that solution is then determined, and it's determined by how well it solves the problem. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Sure, absolutely. I mean, this is a heuristics one, right? Well, it's not necessarily NP complete, right? It could be an NP hard problem.
No, it is NP complete.
Okay, well, I mean, either way, your optimal is a little confusing. It's best solution. You're right. Or optimal solution. It's whatever what we're choosing as being our representation of what we think it should be. Satisfies the solution. Right. Satisfy. Right. What's that? Satisfies. Right. So anyway, the energy is determined by how well it satisfies the problem. Then we randomly change the solution. Of course, how we randomly... How we do that is just dependent on the problem itself. Then we use an acceptance probability to determine if we're basically going to accept this solution or if we're going to move on. And basically, it's dependent on how well its fitness was determined. If the temperature of the current solution is lower, more accessible, we then run this, we just automatically accept it. If the temperature of the current solution is higher, it is then passed through this algorithm right here. Just basically just this equation. And all it says is that if the temperature is higher, we are more likely to accept random crappy solutions. If the temperature is lower, we're less likely to. And then we reduce the temperature. And we keep iterating through until the temperature reduces to the point where our search space gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then we have I showed a cooling schedule here to determine when what the next temperature is going to be. And this is just a geometric cooling schedule. And then you just do that over and over and over again until you come up with a solution. The different kind of parameters that you can adjust inside the simulated annealing is we can change the initial temperature. The initial temperature is going to make it either more effective or more fast, or more. It's going to make it quicker. Obviously, you want to make sure that it's a high enough temperature that you can do an expansive enough search, but at the same time, you want to make sure that it's something that can be completed in a reasonable amount of time. We have to determine what our final temperature is going to be. We looked at our last cooling schedule, and that will end in 0, but not all cooling schedules will necessarily end in 0. You might end up in a negative number somewhere, and you have to make sure you account for that. And then the temperature function, pretty much there's many different kinds of these. Like I said, I showed the geometric one. You just have to, it's all a matter of kind of figuring out what your problem space is and using that to try to help determine how you want the cooling rate to be. And then the number of iterations at each temperature. The next thing we'll look at is swarm intelligence. Swarm intelligence is, I think, is kind of the more fascinating one. Uses the idea of collective behavior in decentralized, self-organized systems. It's made up, basically, you have individual little, in some cases they're called agents, in some cases they're called particles. It's all basically what you want to call it. And it's made up of each one of these individual ones. And each individual particle is given a set of rules to follow. These rules kind of define the behavior of each individual particle by itself. And in the end, this local behavior allows for emergence of global behavior. So what this means is, if you've ever seen a flock of birds or a school of fish, basically they're all kind of grouping together. And the question is, how do they do that? You see a flock of geese, and you see the one at the front followed by all the geese behind them, and you might be tempted to think that basically that geese is in charge. But it's not true, right? Ants colonies are the same kind of thing. If I shoot that goose in the front, that flock of birds are going to keep going. They're not going to fall apart. So that no one bird is in charge of this entire flock. But in the end, the behavior acts as one entity. And how this does it is by using simple rules. If, say, the bird is given, or in this agent or this particle is given a rule, basically you're supposed to stay a certain distance away from another same agent as yourself, and you have to not hit things, maybe a couple other rules. As those rules are processed, over time things start to merge together and they develop this behavior. So we can do something very similar in computers. And the one I was going to look at is called ant colony optimization. And ant colony optimization basically simulates ant food searches. So the way ants move, let's say that we have a brick and we have two pieces of food. One is farther from the other one. And I didn't have a slide for this, unfortunately. And I don't have a whiteboard, which would help. But two ants leave from either direction, going to that food source. The shorter ant is going to reach the food source first. He's going to turn around and come back. The one on the longer path is going to take much longer. It's going to come back around. Now, they use pheromones that they leave, and they create a trail down along this of these pheromones. What happens is the shorter path has a stronger amount of pheromones. As the ant goes along, comes back, drops more pheromones. The other one has been exposed to the environment more, so there's less pheromone. As the next ant comes along, they're going to look at that pheromone trails, and they're going to make a decision on which path they're going to take. They won't necessarily pick the trail with the most pheromone. They may choose the other one, so there's a probability at that point of determining which trail to take. more will take the shorter path, some take the longer, but as more and more start taking the shorter path, you'll have more and more, the ant trail becomes where there's the vast majority of them are following the one and very few ants are following the other, to the point where you see that string of ants that you see every once in a while, where they're all following the same path. Right, so they fall back. So you end up creating somewhat of a positive feedback loop. How do we do this as an algorithm? And this is the easiest way to picture how this algorithm is useful is where I've seen it used is in trying to analyze graphs, or in routing. I don't know how people deal with networks, but I've read some papers on how to use ant colony optimization for advanced network routing in really complicated networks. So what we do is we create an initial population of the ant, and we distribute them all over the entire the graph space. And we have to distribute it everywhere because we don't know the proper path. And remember, in this particular one, we're looking at paths. Each ant keeps a list, what's called a taboo list, which basically is a list of all the places that they've been. So the one thing that's important is that it doesn't keep cross over at the same path. So in the beginning, when the ant's making a determination of, or the agent is making a determination of which path to take, we have an algorithm that is actually going to, or an equation that's going to stay the same through the entire process. But at the very beginning, there's no pheromones laid down. There's nothing. So the probability of either path is pretty open. Now, so this is going to end up going to be 0 or whatever it is the general probability is for that. And the algorithm is pretty basic. It's basically just a function of the heuristic measurement times the pheromone level as a summation of all of the ants, all the trails' pheromone levels. So when the ant makes its tour, so these are the equations we're going to use. The ant makes its tour. It's going to decide what the pheromone level of the path is going to be, and it determines that by it's basically the change in pheromone level is a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a given number, a chosen number, and the path of the path of the ant. But the actual pheromone level, a constant. Sorry, Q is a constant. My words are leaving me. Actual pheromone level is calculated by taking that change and multiplying it by the current path, and then multiplying it again or actually it's multiplying the change against another constant, which is usually between 0 and 1, just to give you a little bit more randomness, and then adding that to the current path, and then you have what would be the current pheromone level. And at the same time, the pheromone evaporation is calculated basically by multiplying the pheromone level by a number that's 1 minus our constant probability number. Oops. So how does it work? Each ant uses that initial probability equation like we looked at to determine where to go. In the beginning, of course, like I said, it doesn't have anything to do. The equation doesn't have any numbers yet to fill in with it. As the ant passes through a node, that node is entered first into its taboo list, and then the pheromone level is calculated. And using those equations that we showed, the actual pheromone deposit is calculated, and then when all the ants have actually finished all their paths, they restart the cycle. At that point, we have numbers to stick in that probability. So it starts to change as different paths have different weights based on that pheromone level. As more paths follow it and less evaporation happens. And as I said, more and more tours happen, the number of paths becomes smaller and smaller, and eventually you have one path determined. These are some of the uses I said. Really, like I said, really dynamic, really complicated routing systems. People have academically shown how that you can solve some of those problems using ant colony optimization. I've actually even seen papers written on how to use using ant colony optimization for some cryptographic analysis, which is a little out there. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Okay. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is genetic algorithms, but I'm going to give, I guess, a high school bio lesson again, just to make sure that we're all... The benefit of this is, like I said, in the end what happened is scientists said, you know, biology and evolution provide us a method of understanding how problems are solved in real world. The biology's had to deal with some of the same things we've had. Can we learn from the way that it does things and try to emulate that? So the first concept is evolution, which is a change in traits within a population through inheritance. This change happens through multiple generations over and over again. We end up with white bears in the North Pole or wherever the white bears are. I'm not a biologist. Random mutations can create new genetic combinations, and really it's one of the very important keys to this whole process. As these changes happen, become more common. As these changes start to become more common or even more rare, we have an evolution, a process moving forward happening. Another way of looking at it is it can be called the spontaneous generation of innovative functional structures. It's kind of a more technical term. Basically, I can do more things, so I'm evolving. Natural selection. Natural selection occurs when mutation allows an organism to be better fit in its environment. It survives, as we all know from Darwin Awards. As these organisms survive, there is a higher probability that its genetic material will be passed on. So the idea is that if I can live, I can have more children, and my children can have more children as they start to mate with people that also have higher fitness. These traits are passed to offspring, have a higher probability of surviving. These traits that are less likely to survive, meaning that if I'm going to die before I have children, then most likely those traits are not going to be passed on. And then it continues. So the fundamental building block to this entire thing is DNA. And I'm not going to pronounce that, deoxyribonucleic acid. I think I said it right. It contains all the genetic code for all development. It's all those genes. It makes up the fundamental pieces of the chromosomes, where the chromosomes are going to be very important for how the genetic algorithm works. And only 1.5% of the actual DNA encodes protein, if anybody's interested. What the other 98.5% is somewhat, much of it is a mystery. Some of it's for determining how transmission rate happens. Many people heard junk DNA. They will classify this as junk DNA. Lately, they've found that more and more of it is actually maybe a little more important than we thought. And then when cell division happens, each cell gets an exact replica of the DNA. And the genes are part of the DNA, and they're a part that actually encodes a specific protein. So, as you know, what color our eyes are, what color our hair is, how our eyes work, all based on genes and how it sequences these proteins. Also contains some regulatory sequences for adjusting rate of when transcription happens. In our case, genes and chromosomes work in what's called alleles. And an allele is a pair of genes, each appearing on the same chromosome. And that'll make sense here in a second. Chromosomes are basically a collection of hundreds of thousands of genes all together inside the DNA structure, or all built out of DNA. And they're a collection of all the chromosomes is called the genome. So basically, if you were to create a number or a map of all of your genes, it's called your genotype. And if in your body, or the representation of those genes is our physical manifestation, it's called the phenotype. Our chromosomes are what's called homologous, and that means that we have two pair of like genes. They're not exactly the same. They're like each other. And the idea is that we got one from each of our parents. And we have 46 total genes, 22 of them are homologous. One pair is not, and that's the XY gene, which determines what our sex is. What's that? Chromosome, sorry. Did I say the wrong word? I said gene, didn't I? It's 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, 22 are homologous, one is not, or two are not. Now, when sexual reproduction happens, each sexual reproduction cell has 23. The question is, how did we go from 46 chromosomes to 23 chromosomes? And this concept is going to become very important in our algorithm, and it's a concept called meiosis. And it's how sexual reproduction cells called germ cells are made. This happens when the cells destined to become reproduction cells are created. In each of the cells, those cells, the number of chromosomes that are passed on is reduced in half. And the question is how? And really it's done randomly. So that when the germ cell is created, a completely random algorithm is run in your body that says, take this particular chromosome from this one, from this allele, and this one from this one. And so you develop the 23 chromosomes. And that's where, and then when we're developing those chromosomes, we have a concept of crossover. And this is kind of where the whole, this is how we as a sexually reproducing people evolve. Crossover happens during the meiosis period. So we get a chromosome from our parents, and we get one from each of our parents, or a mom and our dad. And on each of those chromosomes is a bunch of genes. Now, we might have genes that are considered wild genes, which basically mean they're the original way the gene was meant, non-mutated. Some people might have mutated versions of these genes. When crossover happens, it basically decides which gene we should replace with another one. So we create a new chromosome based on breaking apart the two chromosomes and create the new one. That chromosome is then handed off to the germ cell, and that's what's used for the reproduction. So it's random. The frequency of this recombination is determined by genetic distance. If two genes are really far apart from each other, there is a good chance that they might recombine or cross over. If they're really close to each other, they have a tendency to stay more stable. Another important concept is mutation. And mutation is a change in the DNA through some kind of outside influence. This can happen through ultraviolet light, radiation, viruses. I put in here, I think it's kind of interesting that if you look at our DNA, there's lots and lots of samples of virus DNA in there. So we are, in effect, kind of descendant, in a way, if you look at it, of viruses. Mutations can affect the somatic cells, and somatic cell is just basically a non-sexual cell. And that's where cancer comes from and some other things like that. The vast majority of mutations are either bad or neutral. I give an example here of one where it's beneficial. It's basically one example of a mutation that's actually made people either more resistant to the HIV, or in some situations where one parent had the gene and one parent didn't, that helps to delay the onset of AIDS. Okay. So we'll talk about genetic algorithms. So what we're doing here is we're now using those principles that we learned to simulate the evolutionary properties to solve problems. In this case, we're going to work over a population of solutions. Rather than in simulated annealing and hill climbing, where we had one solution we were working with, we're actually going to work with multiple solutions. Each solution represented as a chromosome. And the candidate solution that we're looking through are called phenotypes, but we're basically going to call them chromosomes. Typically, solutions, I say, are coded as binary strings. And, well, I'll talk about that in a second. And here is basically the steps that we go through for the genetic algorithm. We're going to create the population. We're then going to select survivors based on a fitness function. We create offspring based on these survivors. And then we evaluate the fitness function and determine, at that point we make a determination. Do we have still a dramatic amount of evolution? If not, then we've probably reached the end of as much as we can do, so we end the algorithm. Also, we can end it based on how many generations we are going to allow. We might say that we let 500 generations, and that would be called a run. So, what we're trying to like match the idea of biology and their fitness idea. In biology, a fitness function in biology is really easy, survival. In our case, it's not so simple. Inheritance is basically the way the genetic operator is going to work, and I'm going to go into several different genetic operators. But I want to talk a second about the chromosomes, because how you represent your chromosomes, your solutions, is very important. Initially, John Holland, who's one of the original inventors of the let's see, actually, I'm moving ahead myself. So these are random. Over time, we find the best solution. The design of the chromosome, like everything else, is dependent on the problem you're trying to solve. And we'll see this in a second when we're looking at the different chromosomes. Binary encoding was basically the first way that this was done, and that's because one of the inventors, John Holland, used this to solve the problems at the time. So that's the one that's considered the most well understood and the most often used. And basically that means that the chromosome is listed as a bit string. They work really well with fixed length and fixed order binary encodings. The problem is that it can get more complicated when you change the length or change some of the ordering. One of those things that people are researching, but they don't necessarily know the best way to use this kind of thing. Another way of encoding it is what they call many-character and real-valued encoding. What that means is that each gene, if you will, in the chromosome or chromosome is either a character, a word, or maybe a real number. It's not a bit. It's not a binary number. And for instance, this could be effective in some oh yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I guess I just had a question, want to know what is the most efficient application of these algorithms?
So the one thing to think about when you're thinking about these kind of algorithms is what's called no free lunch. I don't know if people have heard of no free lunch. And it basically means that no generic algorithm is going to be better than a specific one. So the times when these algorithms are most effective is when you don't know what algorithm to use. So for instance, if you're doing a search or you're doing a sort over a finite file, for instance, you're never going to use one of these things because we have binary sorts and we can use those much more effectively. But let's say we're trying to create a grammar parser, right? We could create a grammar parser using a ton of regexes. But that would be really complicated, and if there's any changes over time, you would have to create more and more regexes to try to deal with that. Now, but this is where these come in, and they help basically as they're learning and then start adapting, the algorithm can deal with those kind of changes. Does that make sense?
So it's similar to AI algorithms?
I mean, in the end, it is an AI algorithm. That's what these are. These are weak-side AI algorithms. Right, right, and I've seen things like that, and there's tons and tons of research. In the end, when we talk about how these things work, there's even research on still trying to understand how genetic algorithms work because it's not really clear. They've developed some mathematical models around it, but in the end, we've got some theories, but that's about it. But yeah, so encoding is one of those things where you've got researchers all around the world in universities just trying to resolve how to encode problems correctly. Another one way of people are doing encoding is tree encoding, and everybody knows what a binary tree looks like. Not all trees have to be binary, but and this works great because, as you know, it gives you open-endedness. The tree can go on. But, of course, that's the double-edged sword because it can go on forever. And then, of course, you start losing your ability to be able to search this space because the tree goes out of control. And how do you choose the best one? Like I said, it's dependent on the problem. You basically have to analyze the problem and kind of decide from there, what direction you want to go in. So crossover. So the genetic algorithm, it's considered one of the primary features that makes a genetic algorithm do what it's supposed to do. Actually, one thing I'd like to point out that I should have pointed out earlier, there's actually even some contention sometimes about what a genetic algorithm is. What I'm showing here is really a generic basis of what genetic algorithms are. And there are more specific type descriptions and explanations. So it's kind of interesting that way. Like I said, it's still very academic. It's an operator, a genetic operator, used to force diversity in the chromosomes. So in this case, we don't work with alleles, we don't work with pairs. We just have the amount of chromosomes we have is the amount we have. And we randomly choose, when we're choosing these things like these crossover, we're just going to randomly choose a couple of chromosomes. But 2 chromosomes are chosen, and as in our biology reference. And they are randomly broken and attached. The question is, how do we determine how we're going to randomly break these things and reattach them? The first solution, and I have some example code that I'll show you in a little bit, and this is the one that ends up getting used, is called a 1-point crossover. And what this basically does is you track through the 2 different chromosomes. You pick a point where you want to do a swap, and then all the data from that point down gets swapped between the 2 chromosomes. And you have now created 2 new chromosomes. The problem with this is that if this is too big, you're starting to move large amounts of data around. And so your randomization is actually kind of narrow. For one thing, you cannot combine all possibilities. I give an example here of 1 dot star 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 1 and star 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 1 1 star star. You're never going to be able to make that the other combination. So those are going to be solutions you're never going to find. You can end up destroying large chromosome sets as it's holding on too tightly to certain data sets. And it has a tendency for hitchhikers. If you can imagine, if I'm cutting a chromosome in half, there could be data in there that's not very useful, but it's always going to be moved around more likely than not because of how large the section we're picking up. We end up with a kind of a loci preference. The endpoints end up getting always together. So to solve that problem, they decided they use 2-point crossover, which basically means we choose 2 points in the algorithm, in the chromosome, and we take the chunk out of the middle and we swap that. This helps a little bit because we're working with smaller data sets. So anytime you're working with smaller data sets, you're more likely to get less information and less carryover from other solutions, or less carryover will happen. This method, it reduces the damage to large data sets and also resolves the endpoint problem. There's this one that's called cut and splice, which is another one of those ones that's really theoretical because in the end what happens with this one is you're going to end up with different sized chromosomes all over the place, which most of the time you're not really going to be able to deal with. That's going to make no sense. And you're going to end up with all kinds of faults. But there are times I've seen it and I know how to make the splice, but I've never ever come across a scenario where it's actually something you'd want to do. But it's always possible. There's something out there. As things got more advanced, they worked on what's called uniform crossover. Parameterized uniform crossover basically means we're going to walk through every single one of the genes of the chromosome, and we're going to run a probability analysis over it and use that to determine whether we're going to do the crossover or not. And we'll do that through every one of them. Time-consuming, but obviously going to be very effective in making sure that we're truly going through all the different possible solutions. One that's not quite as time-consuming, maybe not quite as effective, but more effective than even the 2-point crossover, is what's called the half-uniform crossover. And we basically take half the bits and swap them. And we have an algorithm. We take the Hamming distance and then divide that by 2, and that's how many different bits are crossed over. Not all solutions can be swapped like this, however. Anything that requires, make sure you have there are no duplicates, like the traveling salesman problem, wouldn't be very effective with this. The next genetic operator to look at is mutation. And basically this adds just that extra layer of diversity in into our environment. It keeps offspring from being too similar and slowing down the evolutionary process. And one way to determine how you're going to do this mutation is basically after you pass through your crossover algorithm, you run another passover of a mutation algorithm. And it has a probability, do I mutate or do I not mutate? Selection is and then the next really important part. And basically, we decide which chromosomes are going to move on and which don't. Which are the ones that are surviving. This is responsible for deciding what chromosomes will survive. The plan is to let the fittest specimen survive and let the less fit die off. This has to be carefully balanced. If you maybe run across a couple of chromosomes that seem really fit and start focusing on those early on, you're leaving off a whole lot of solution sets behind, and you're more than likely going to hit a local optimum or a local solution that isn't necessarily the best one. Too weak a selection process, meaning that you're letting too many things reproduce, and it could take a really long time. So the first way that they did this selection was based on, in fact, the first one, which the John Holland made, was the fitness proportionate selection. Basically, the selection is proportional to what the fitness is. And the first one was the roulette wheel selection. And you could picture a wheel, and there's the roulette wheel, the little arrow that comes into it. And each chromosome has a slice of that wheel dependent on what its fitness number is. So the wheel is spun as many times as there are chromosomes, and where that needle lands those are the ones that move on. It appears to, does not work very well over a very large data set, or it doesn't work very well across smaller data sets. It would be pretty effective over extremely large data sets as statistically it starts balancing out. But if you're not doing very many spins, it's kind of loses its ability to be truly random. The next one was the stochastic universal sampling, and it was basically like the roulette wheel, but instead of spinning the wheel, it basically randomly placed points around the wheel and said those are the ones that are going to those are the ones that are moving on. The selection then at that point, sigma scaling is the next one that they developed, and that was developed probably about 10 or 15 years ago. And basically what it does is it applies pressure, what's called selection pressure, to each one to the fitness function. I'm sorry, not the fitness function. It applies selection pressure in the selection process. So what it wants to do is it wants to make the selection process constant through the entire thing so that there is a chance for crossover of maybe possibly less desirable results that may end up eventually being more desirable. And if you look, it's a pretty basic algorithm, and basically what it's saying is we take the mean deviation, we take the results as it is so far, and we divide it by the mean deviation of the fitness, which in the very beginning, the deviation is not going to be very great. So this number is not going to be very big, and then we've got a more liberal crossover selection process. As that deviation gets stronger, though, it's going to be less and less crossover happens, or less and less likely that that selection is going to happen. So at the beginning, the deviation will be high. Deviation for each individual will not be drastically higher than the mean. This forces more diverse reproduction, and the diversity of the reproduction is really the most important part of the genetic algorithm, and for it to work. The next one to look at is the Boltzmann selection, and the idea is that sometimes you don't want it to be even, or you don't want it to be even across the entire selection process. Sometimes you want to be able to apply more pressure. Sometimes you want to apply less pressure. So in the beginning, it's possible that you want to have less pressure. You want the development process or the selection process to be very weak to allow a lot more recombination to happen. But then as you get closer and closer to your solution, or you maybe want it to be less reproduction happening, more focusing on the solutions you've got, kind of like in a simulated annealing way in the cooling process. The next one to look at is called rank selection. And this one it takes away the fitness number out of the entire process. So what it does is it basically determines which ones are the fittest, and doesn't really necessarily keep the number. It just says this one's the most fittest, the next one down is the next, and it ranks them based on that. And then there's a probability of which ones are going to then be selected. So what that means is that even if the top one has a much higher number, the chance isn't actually any different for the second one to be selected. And this allows for a much more even distribution of these chromosomes to be selected. It can be good in the beginning when the absolute fitness of each individual allows for, or let's see, good in the beginning, not knowing the absolute fitness of each individual allows for more diversity. Sometimes, though, there are times you might need to know this absolute fitness. One thing is this can actually be fairly effective, or has proven to be fairly effective against noisy fitness functions, where you might call into the function and get different results at different times, even with the same input. Then there's tournament selection, and this was kind of meant to make things, to speed things up a little bit. As it mentions, all selection requires two different passes, one to actually calculate the fitness or the deviation, depending on which one you're using, and calculating the expected value. And it can be somewhat time-consuming. What this does is it basically pulls out two random chromosomes. A random number, R, is selected, and if R is less than a parameter, then it either chooses the more fit one or the less fit one. And then both are returned back into the population to be then possibly selected again. There's a concept of steady state selection, which I don't really know a whole lot about because I've never really used anything like this. But basically the idea is that we're not replacing very many chromosomes. And it appears to be mostly effectively used against when you're using multiple chromosomes to solve a problem, meaning that the result is actually the tying together these chromosomes is the actual solution. It's not using each one as its own solution. And that's used in rule-based learning. So in evolution again, when different organisms start to become very diverse, they lose that ability to be able to reproduce with each other. The genetic information is so dissimilar that reproduction can't happen. Even if sometimes, usually when that happens, you can't even generate offspring. There are, of course, rare exceptions, like the liger, which is my favorite animal. We can use this idea in genetic algorithms as well to, once again, force diversity. Once again, diversity is really the most important thing in a genetic algorithm. A function is used to determine how one possibility is to use a function to determine how similar two chromosomes are. If you bring two chromosomes together and you're intending to do a crossover, you can run a function over them and determine if they're too similar. If they're too similar, they can be dumped right back into the pool and two more chosen. That way, because if two chromosomes are too similar, any kind of crossover that happens won't be all that effective. We're preventing incest, which I hear is taboo. We're not trying to make species, we're just trying to make populations more diverse. Another possibility is creating, I think John Holland thought of this one as well, creating a mating tag, which is we put a tag on the chromosome that says I'm, blood type B, or I'm this kind of a mate. And then you pass a function over it, and that way it doesn't have to actually calculate how similar it is. It just looks for the mating tag and says these two are too similar, so once again this doesn't happen. How's time going? Oh, am I supposed to be almost done? All right, I'll go faster. So genetic algorithms, like I said, they're not really well understood. They're simple to describe and simple to code, but the results you get end up being pretty complicated. Schemata theory, which I don't have time to get into at this point, was the original kind of model that was come up with how these work, and it's a theory where each schema is basically a building block. And the theory is that genetic algorithms focus on discovering and focusing and recombining good building blocks in a highly parallelized way. And good solutions are made up of building blocks, of good building blocks. That's basically the genetic algorithms and the evolutionary algorithms as I'm going to point them out. I have some code that I was going to show that I wrote. That's an example of genetic programming, which basically is an implementation of genetic algorithms. Its purpose is not to make a solution, but to actually make a program that is the best way to solve a problem. Let's see here. Does anybody have any questions from that before I bring this up? Okay. Basically what you see right here is there's some initial variables, things like the crossover probability, the mutation probability, the maximum number of generations, the maximum chromosomes we're going to have, the maximum number of programs, because this is basically building programs. Each chromosome is a program made up of instructions. Now, this is simple. This is a very simple example, because basically what we've got here is a VM, and that VM basically takes I'll show that real quick. That VM takes a very limited amount of instructions. As you can see here, it takes a dupe, swap, multiply, add, and cross and over. Check to see if the stack's over. It just those are the only opcodes that it takes. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a program that uses this machine right here to solve a problem. And the problem that we're going to solve, or the problem that we want to solve is x cubed plus y squared plus z. So very simple. Our fitness function is going to be very simple as well. But it's really meant to show you what we've got. So as we said, we've defined our various variables. As you can see here, I've got what's called Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, and max fit. And that's basically going to be our fitness. And I'll show you the criteria that makes up those. Those are not very important. So if you see main, the first thing that it's going to do is it's going to setting up the current population while we're within our max generation, meaning our number that we define. We initialize the population. So take a quick look at the initialize the population. Basically, we're saying we've created a structure, and we're initializing each member of that structure, and right there. And basically, it's just part of a program. Its fitness as length. Fairly simple. Okay. So we initialize the population. We perform our fitness check for the first time, and then while we're during our generations, we perform selection, do the fitness check again, a lot of printing of stuff, and that's pretty much it. That's the fundamental of the genetic algorithm. Now, the important things at this point are what are its fitness is doing, and how does it do its selection. First thing we'll look is the fitness. So the fitness check is basically we create a random solution for this x cubed y squared plus 1. We then take that, we make an answer based on that. So we create a random solution for it. We just pop some numbers in there. We send it to the virtual machine, and we get results back. And our fitness basically says if we get nothing back, then this is not a very good fit. If we get a problem back, but it's possibly a pretty good fit. But if we get the answer back from our random selected number of characters, then we know it's a good fit. Right. And then it just goes through reevaluating the fitness and saving the total fitness. Fairly simple. The fitness function is, as you can see, is fairly simple because our problem is fairly simple. But basically, we defined from telling it to run through this machine how to make the solutions. And then the selection criteria. Here's the select process, the select parent. What to say about this? It's all pretty straightforward. And then perform reproduction. We have a cross point. We use a random. We use a random where the max is based on the current population and the program size. Add one. And then we run through, different types of the different selection processes, or different selection points. And then we also have a mutate point where basically we just run through it. We do a random number check again to make sure we actually want to mutate. If we do, then we do the mutation. We increase mutations. And then the selection is basically based, as you can see right there, it just goes call select parent again, and then perform reproduction based on up here. Again, so I don't. I can probably get it for you. This is a combination of mine and somebody else's, so I have to pull somebody else's out of it and put mine back in. But I wasn't fully done with it, so. Plus I really wanted it to be in Java, not in C, but I hate translating things from C to Java. That's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Oh, so, I have to be honest, the biggest, I've done security all my life, but me learning genetic algorithms had really nothing to do with security. So when I thought about doing this talk, I talked with a couple of guys, friends of mine from the Ghetto Hackers, and we were trying to figure out, what could we say was a good application for security for this? And Fried was very much like, you don't have to tell them any applications, they can figure it out on their own. But if you do enough research, you find one of the big places this is being used is in IDSs. Understanding IDS, because basically what an IDS is I've got a problem and I've got a whole lot of rules I need to compare it to. And how do I do that? Do I just run through every single one of them, which would be an exhaustive search basically, or is there a smarter way to go through these rules? And genetic algorithms can help with that. And there's, or used in combination. I've seen them used in combination with simulated annealing to be able to do that. So I was actually at one point thinking of writing something that was a little more security based, but it was taking too long. But yeah, that's fundamentally IDSs. I've seen it used in cryptanalysis a little bit when looking through key spaces or something like that. Anything else? Nobody? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.